Good day and welcome to the Strong Ambition Podcast. I am your host, Raymond Lavoie. We talk about training, nutrition, and most importantly, mindset of ambition. I want to talk to people about their ambitions. I want to understand and share concepts around personal growth and development. I believe that life isn't about the pursuit of happiness, but the happiness within the pursuit. Today's podcast, we actually have Raymond Vincent Lavoie. Ray is a longtime friend. He absolutely embodies ambition and determination. I've known him since we were kids and we've been very close friends. He's really inspired me to see how hard someone can work for something and show absolute dedication. I watched him go through his PhD program as he has got a PhD in business and marketing, and he's a professor at Merrimack College. What's really amazing about him is his ability to absolutely immerse himself into whatever he's focusing on. It's almost like a superpower. I remember living with him, and I would walk by and see him working and just kind of say something, and it's like if you didn't hear anything, his blinders on. He was so focused on what he was doing, or he was maybe ignoring it, but I'm pretty sure he was focused, and he loves what he does so much that it's you'll even hear him talk about it a lot in here because it's like he's in a flow state. And for those who don't know what flow is being emotionally involved in something so intensely that time seems irrelevant. And he's going to give an even better definition because that's what he does for his research. So it's very perfect and suitable to him because he's so good at it, and I've always seen him do it. The other incredible thing is he's got the intelligence of an academic, but an absolute social animal. So he not only puts in all the hard work, but he's definitely always the life of the party. So super excited to have him on the show. It'll be fun to actually ask my good friend all the research and understanding of his story and his upbringing and his influences. So should be a great show for you. And without further ado, here is Raymond Lavoie. Welcome, Ray Lavoie, to the Strong Ambitions Podcast. How are you doing today, Ray?
Awesome, dude. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Thanks for joining. So I gave a little bit of a pretty short introduction on basically about yourself. We've known each other our whole lives, but I would love to hear from you, for everyone else listening. Tell us about yourself. Tell us about your upbringing and a little about your education.
Okay, you want me to go way back to the roots in Starbuck, Manitoba, or where do you want me to start?
Oh yeah, that's where it starts.
Yeah, you got to start there, right? Can't leave
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, so Starbuck it's a small town, couple hundred people, right? It's farmer town. That's where I grew up. I grew up in the town in Starbuck and moved from there to Winnipeg later in university, but lived there for most of my life, which was it's interesting, right? And it's humbling. I think that's a good place to start. Is you grow up around all these people that care for you, and few amount of people, and then you kind of transition into Winnipeg, which at the time was a big city, which is kind of hilarious to think back on now, but we used to call it the city. And now I live in Boston, so it just keeps getting bigger. But yeah, so started in Starbuck, went to Winnipeg for university, and then I got my PhD at U of M as well. And then for work, I moved to Boston, which is what I'm doing now. I'm a professor at Merrimack College, teach marketing. That's, I guess, as a general path, that's what I've done overall, where I've been.
Yeah, so let's come back to Starbuck there. Tell us about your upbringing for influences, because I know your dad started a boxing club in Starbucks. So yeah, how was that kind of an influence for you?
Oh, dad was huge. I mean, my dad's intense, that, and he's a very competitive dude, and he pushed us really hard, and so I've got him to thank for a lot of my my makeup for sure. Played a ton of sports growing up, right? So it was hockey in the winters, baseball in the summers, and I ended up getting into golf later. But Richie, he pushed us, me and my brothers and sister, and he had a strong work ethic. And like you mentioned, he started the boxing club, and so that's kind of who he is, right? Like Richie's an intense, emotional boxer kind of guy at his core, and so that bled into how he kind of pushed us in other sports like hockey. So I mean, Richie would coach us in hockey, so he'd be right there and he'd be on us if we weren't working hard, and he'd let us know if we, didn't put in a good effort, which which I think was really good because as a kid, sometimes you don't have the perspective on what's really important, and you might see criticism or a parent pushing you in a certain way as negative, but now I'm thankful for what he did because he always preached work ethic, right? So, if we went out, let's say we were playing hockey and you got 3 goals, but you weren't really working hard. It was more about, your work ethic that game and what you could have done different. Whereas let's say you go and play a game and, as a kid, you didn't score. For me, I was a forward. So if I didn't get many points, I'd be upset. I'd say, oh, that was a crappy game. I didn't do that well. He goes, but you're busting your ass out there, and that's awesome. That's all you want is like the work ethic part of it. You put in what you can, and the results like goals and assists, they'll come. But what matters is that you put in the effort. If you didn't put in the effort, that's a problem. So that was huge. And Richie would the other stuff that he did really good is he'd put me in situations that I was uncomfortable, and I wouldn't have done myself. This even spans beyond sports, even to church. So I remember this probably more vividly than actual sports scenarios at church. We would go to church in the city every Sunday, and we went to St. Vital Parish, big church, hundreds of people in there. And he wanted me to be an altar boy. And so being an altar boy, you'd go up there and you'd be doing your thing in front of, hundreds of people. And I was super nervous, and I would like try to run away, but like, there's no way I'm going to do that. And I was petrified to do it. But he's like, just do it. It'll be okay. Just you trust me and it'll be fine. And so I did it once, and of course it went good. And I just loved it from there. But he did the same thing in sports. Like I would go from Starbuck and I'd play for city teams. In hockey, it was playing for McDonald, going out from Starbuck and trying out for the gold team, meeting a bunch of guys that I, didn't know from different towns. But really baseball, I'd go and play baseball in the city and play with guys that I didn't know them at all. They're from Winnipeg. I was from Starbucks. So he would put me in these positions where it was challenging. Like I had to make a team with a bunch of guys I didn't know in sports. And he'd put me in those, positions, even in something like as simple as being an altar boy at church. So he was really good at putting me in those situations that I was uncomfortable. And it was, just me, and I had to like get to know everybody constantly. Right. So it's like, okay, with hockey, with baseball, at church, I was always in situations that I was uncomfortable, that were new, and I had to meet people to fit in there, and I had to work hard to try to impress people because they had no clue who I was. So I always felt like I had to work harder to get noticed because nobody knew who I was. And I guess that ties back to, the roots in Starbuck, where the hell is that? Nobody's ever been there before. So yeah, I'd say Richie, growing up, and the stuff that he had me do, and preaching work ethic really shaped who I am today. For sure.
Yeah, no, he's such a powerful influence on anyone that he's with, and I can only imagine having him as a father. And I think one of the interesting things about Richie too, like, you and I both know when he's talking about boxing, nothing fires him up more. Like, you would always laugh about, okay, Ryland's talking to Rich about boxing. We're not going to see those two for an hour. And, but
Seriously, at least an hour.
yeah, at least an hour, maybe two or three.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I thought was really interesting was the transition you saw Richie go through, right? Because Richie had a point where he messed up his ankle to this day, and he had to transition his career. What was it like watching your dad go through that?
Yeah, so I was pretty young when that happened to him, when he broke his ankle. But what you're mentioning before was like his passion and his fire, um, which never really left him per se, but he held himself in a different way. And he's talked to me about that, just trying to be a really good and caring father and more gentle, which is an interesting contrast, because he went from a very passionate, fiery, like boxer fighter kind of guy to trying to be more of a caring and nurturing father type of persona. But you could still see it come through in a good way, right? And that's what I was talking about with sports. Like, he broke his ankle. We must have been grade 4, 3 or 4. Something. We're young.
Mhm.
So vaguely remember him, lying on the bed with his broken ankle and recouping. But the important parts of it, the passion and the fire related to sports, still came through when he was coaching us and talking to us about it. Um, so yeah, I think he harnessed it in a good way. But I only hear stories. I can't tell you what it was like back in the day. Apparently, it was pretty intense. From an emotional perspective, the way he'd approach sports, um, which is really cool. But I never really saw that. So I always kind of saw the more, subdued version as a father, but the passion really coming through related to sports when he was coaching.
Yeah, yeah, and I was just like kind of always, was, in awe of how he knew he had to transition into his academic career, and he moved forward with that. So I thought that was really cool. But like you say, it will always, you get him fired up about whether it's hockey, definitely boxing. You just see that fire in his eyes, and you hear it in his voice. So it was always kind of cool. Now, you as being the oldest, did that become a responsibility for you? And was that a part of what really ensured that you were pushing yourself along with all of Richie's influence?
I don't know. That's tough to say. I never really thought about it with regards to being the oldest. That never really crossed my mind, to be honest. It was always a pride thing, for the family and for myself. But I guess as an older brother, I tried pushing my siblings to be, the best they could and challenge them. And I mean, that's a unique relationship with your siblings, that, right? And there's always sibling rivalries and you push each other, and there's that side of it. But I was never really cognizant of that. I never really thought about that much growing up. Just tried to, do as much as I could. But
Yeah. Well, and it was interesting because I was just talking to, because me and Matt, your youngest brother, and because we were both youngest, and we both took the same course about personalities, and they tend to say that the oldest sibling will really, because they're setting the bar, right? And it's like you say, you might not think about it, but it is intuitive to a degree that you are setting a bar without even knowing it. And my sister, blew it out of the water. So we've, as younger siblings, you now feel like you see a bar, right? So it's a bit different for that perception. But so, with Richie and that upbringing, clearly that's one of the big things that help you with work ethic. What are some of the other things that, helped influence you? Like, you fight off the feeling of laziness so well. Like, I've lived with you and I've known you for a long time, and you just know how to will yourself to put work in. What's some influences, and what kind of helps you with that notion of I have work to do?
well, I don't really think of it as work. Is I think the key. I really enjoy it, and I guess I'll explain my university career there, because I didn't always put a lot of work in. Like when we were in early years university, a lot of those courses, I didn't like them. I thought they're a joke and I had no interest in them, and I didn't put a lot of work in. It wasn't until like my last year of undergrad in marketing, when I started taking courses that I actually really liked, that I started putting a ton of work in, because I enjoyed it and I saw value in it. And from there, it kind of took off, because I actually didn't always know that I wanted to be I never thought about being a professor ever. I was like, that's not me at all. Um, and then it was my last year of undergrad. One of my profs said, "Hey, I like what you're saying in class. You should think about doing some research with me." It's like, okay, that's interesting. Maybe I'll check it out. And started doing that, and I just like fell in love with it, because I'm a curious guy. I want to understand, how things work and why things happen. And so the first project we did, um, it was on the lay theory of love, right? So people's beliefs about what love is and how that influences, what kind of gifts they give in romantic relationships, if they give gifts, and that kind of stuff from a marketing perspective. And it was just intriguing to me. Like I would interview people and talk to them about, what they think love is, and, try to relate that to the type of gifts that they give. And it was fascinating, man. Like just hearing people talk about that, what they think it is, and then the nuances, the differences, and then, finding patterns, like trying to draw patterns from their lay theories to what they do in relationships. It was super interesting. And it made me feel alive. And so I was like, this is right. And so I just kind of followed that, and pursued the master's there. And I fell in love with it. And that makes it super easy. Like I'll plug into work. I'll be writing papers all day now, like every day, doing research. And I love it though. It's really interesting. It's
Yeah.
fascinating. So yeah, you can put in a million hours and it doesn't really feel like work if you really enjoy it.
Yeah. No, I think that's definitely a huge part of it, right? Like it's if you're immersed in it and you're really I actually always thought it was amazing to see you get in your own flow state because and we can probably dive into that here, but like I would when we would live together, I would see you just, in the living room there, just so I could physically see you so zoned in. And I remember like trying to talk to you and you wouldn't hear me. I wasn't sure if you were ignoring me, but I could actually tell that you were so engaged in what you're doing that sounds didn't matter to you. You were so immersed in it. And I think even with, like you still like I would totally understand loving what you're doing and everything like that. Um, so let's kind of dive into this because your ability to focus comes to me from harnessing and I think this might just anecdotal opinion. I think you have an ability to zone yourself into a flow state better than most, and that's possibly what's helped you so much with in doing so well in your career, because that if you're curious about something and you can just stay locked into it, no distractions, anything. So first off, if you could define your view of flow, and do you see it in yourself?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot to uncover there. I'm glad you brought this up, because I love talking about my research and I don't get enough chances to do it. Um, but a big part of what my research is trying to make flow more understandable, because I mean, everybody kind of gets it in the sense that they have their own flow state, right? Something that they can get totally lost in and lose track of everything else. And it's really enjoyable. But academically, it's really not precise. It's almost treated like this magical state that, happens here and there. Um, but we got a paper under review right now that just got a revision that I'm super excited about. And that paper comes up with a new scale to measure flow and conceptualize it to make it really simple. And it's basically two parts. It's got two dimensions. One is the part we just referred to, where you're super absorbed in what you're doing, right? So, your story about me writing a paper or doing schoolwork, you got blinders on, right? So you and your task, and that's it. Your sense of self-awareness, perceptions of time, literally everything else dissolves, right? So that's one part. We call it absorption. The second part we call fluency. Things are going very well, right? So, I mean, you could be plugged into your work, you could be fully absorbed in it, but it's not going forward smoothly. And so that's not flow. But when you're fully engaged in what you're doing, it's just you and the task, and it's going by very smooth, fluently, that's flow. So it's just those two pieces combined is all it is, which is a much simpler way to think about it, because before, the guy that introduced it, Cheek Sent Me High, he's got 9 or 10 things. He's like, these experiences mark flow, which is not very scientific, to be honest. And so what we did is we boiled down all those different states into 2 underlying processes, right? So he would say stuff like, yeah, I felt totally absorbed in the task, lost track of time. And you can actually boil those items down, those 10, into 2 similar experiences, which is what I just described. So that's what my work is. So flow is a state of absorption and fluency. That's it. And so the second part of your question, do I see it in myself? Yeah, I pursue that a lot. That's a goal of mine. It's super enjoyable, right? Like, and that's part of why I started studying it, is I would experience it in sports rarely. It is fleeting, right? You get it, and you hear athletes talk about this all the time. It's like, okay, say a pitcher's pitching a perfect game in the MLB, you hear his teammates talk about what they were doing. Like, I didn't want to say a word. I didn't want to bother him, right? You see someone in that state, you just don't fuck up, right? If you say something to them, you're going to pull them out, right? You don't want to say something, that could have them thinking about something else or pull them out of it. And I think that's really important to note too, related to flow. It's, with regards to getting into it, it's not as much about, what you need to do. It's what you shouldn't do, right? And it's these distractions and types of things that can pull you out of it. And athletes seem to be very in tune with that, and they can recognize when, someone's in flow, and they try not to ruin it. So yeah, I find it in work a decent amount when I write, and I mean, personally, I try to focus, and you can train your attention, right? And we can get into that stuff later too, like stuff like mindfulness. Flow is largely based on attention. So if you can learn how to focus for an extended, period of time, mindfully, you can help yourself get into flow. But a lot of it is setting up the task in a way that'll make it fluent too. And these things that you can't be doing, right? So if you're worried about anything, right? Like, and that's, if you think about the series of thoughts that you'd have in your head, like we're doing this, and then all of a sudden a thought jumps in my head about what I'm going to have for lunch. That pulls you out of it, right? Because by definition, it's not just you and the task anymore. Your attention went to your thoughts about something else. So you have to be able to protect that. And that means that you have to calm down and settle down any worries that you have, right? Someone that's anxious is not going to be able to get into flow, period. Right? If you're anxious and worried about, anything in your life, and this could be anything. This could be beyond the person themselves. This could be what's going on in society. Like down here in the States, people are upset with what's going on politically, and those kind of worries are pervasive, and you're not going to be able to get into flow with even that bothering you, because you're going to think about that. If you actually track your thoughts, I bet for a lot of people that comes up for a large part of the day, and you're just not going to be able to get into flow that way. So flow is a lot of those kind of things as well. literally anything that would pull your attention away from a task is going to disrupt flow, which makes it such a cherished but difficult state to get in and sustain.
Yeah, I think it's such a cool realm. And what was interesting is I always knew it existed as being a goaltender, right? So, it's like you psychologically, there's a lot of pressure there, and you're gonna have days where you're like, I totally can remember, like, to this day, kids, some days I had games where I was just literally in the flow state. I was on top of my game. I was helping my team beat teams that we shouldn't, just because I just felt unstoppable out there. And so flow always made sense to me. But then it was funny because when you got into your research now, talk to someone about flow, they'd be like, "What's flow?" And it just never occurred to me that if you hadn't had sports and you never had
Yeah.
that experience, right? It's completely like, I don't know what that is. So some people might not even know if they have experienced
Yeah,
it.
exactly. And that's the tricky thing that we deal with it. If you play sports, you have a very keen understanding of what it is. I mean, you recognize it at least, right? But people and a lot of academics don't have those experiences. But it can happen anywhere, like playing Tetris. Video games is a great example of it, even searching online. And that's what a big part of my research is we call it micro flow states, just shorter flow states. So I mean, that's another problem with what Csikszentmihalyi did in the early stages is the way he described flow as these, life-changing experiences, like say climbing a mountain or someone painting a masterpiece. There, you're in flow for hours on end. We call that deep flow. But flow happens all the time, in your daily life, whether it's, playing video games or writing a paper, shorter, less intense experiences, but the two parts are there, right? So you're fully focused on what you're doing, you're absorbed in it, and it's going very smoothly and well. That happens a lot throughout the day. And I want to circle back to your story about being a goalie. The task and what you're doing matters so much, right? There's got to be lots of stimuli constantly. And that is kind of behind the term flow, right? So some games, let's say will probably happen a decent amount in McDonald where your team's getting whooped. And so you're busy. And you hear people talk about that, goalies like to be busy as opposed to not. That's conducive to flow, right? Someone's coming down on your glove side. You got to be paying attention to that, right? And you're thinking about what you need to do. Maybe he's going to pass it back door, but you have something that you're paying attention to related to the task. Plays at the far end. You're just watching the boys. You're sitting back. Now your thoughts can wander because the task isn't giving you something that you need to pay attention to constantly. So I think that's a really interesting tie to what a lot of people talk about from a goalie perspective, in that why people like to be busy, and it can get you in that state. And then let's say, your team's, it's in the defensive end. You got a lot of action for a sustained period of time. In your mind now, this is really important. You need to pay attention to this because, if your team's whooping them, it doesn't seem to matter as much. And so that's one thing that really seems to click flow in is it's almost like this primal thing. This is really important for survival, or I really need to pay attention to this. Okay. Or if it's a really big game, right? You'll be focused naturally. But if you're not worried about it, if you think your team's going to win, or, the play's been in the far end, it's easy to lose it. So
Yeah.
I think
And
that's an interesting tie.
And one of the things that I really love that you pointed out was the fluency, and that's what Mahai doesn't like. He doesn't talk about at all, and that kind of has to do in, like how you said, those cues, because as a goalie, there was some games where I might not have had a lot of action, but there was a flow to the game still, and it's like I might not have had 30 shots, but I might have had around 20. And I was able to keep myself engaged with just the right amount of shots at the right time. But that's like still cognitively really hard, because you like, kind of like you say, you sit back and you can relax, but you have to be immensely focused on that game at the other end, so that you never really, like you say, break that state. But like, even just like, to me, that fluency thing makes sense, right? Like, where you're not giving yourself a chance to come out of the thought process of what the game's about.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, it's very powerful. Now, I was just always curious too, because you talk about microflow, and I know you're still pretty early in a lot of these different ways. Flow is so newly researched, like it's barely touched, right? So I was curious if you guys had considered macro flow, if you look at like a daily lifestyle of flow like that.
Yeah, so it's interesting. That's what most people think flow is. I have so many people saying, I was in the flow that day. And that's not flow strictly. It's not flow proper, because flow is like, okay, for what period of time do you have sustained full attention on something? And if you think about your day to day, let's say I was, working or chatting with you and I'm totally in it, experiencing flow, and it can happen in conversation, by the way. Um, so I do that, I'm in flow, and then I go and have some lunch. That's not necessarily flow, but you felt like you were in flow throughout the day, is I think what that perception would be, is like throughout the day you had a lot of experiences of flow. Doesn't mean the whole day was flow, but you had several pockets of flow throughout the day, is what that would mean.
Yeah,
That
so essentially you're looking at flow as, it almost has to be attached to the task at hand. And like you say, if your day flows, that means you're having a bunch of different flow states, but that does not, you can't look at it at a macro scale if you're changing the task.
Yeah, you can, but like it's a series of flow states, right?
Yeah.
And people be like, oh, I'm in the zone lately. That's kind of their intuitive perception that the things that they're doing, they're able to engage with and lock in with, and things are going well. So it'd be like, I would just see that as, yeah, you've been experiencing flow a decent amount, right? Like flow can happen for whatever, like 10 seconds, a minute, hours. Like we're chatting, we could have moments of flow, and then it could break, and then it could come back. And so if you think of a trajectory throughout the day, if you mapped it out, minute to minute, you could block time to be like, okay, they were in it here, and then out, then here. And that's what people have a sense of, is like, they've been in flow a decent amount in what they're doing. But strictly, that's not something that we've looked at. I think it's interesting, and that could be a interesting study to look at, is flow aggregated like that at a macro level. Like what's behind that perception? I think that's what it is, but we haven't actually looked at that. I don't think anybody has, which is really interesting thought.
Yeah, because I feel like that's probably where you're even kind of talking about a lot of, you're trying to utilize these strategies, sell it to businesses so that you can get, employees to utilize their flow states better. So with that concept, what's kind of more on the new edge of your flow research that you'd like to discuss? Also, I want to talk about this really quick. So we're talking about all your flow. Just so the listeners and viewers know, you have 5 publications, and one of them, and I don't think I knew this, you got a best paper award in one of them. Is that right?
Yeah, that was way back. That was actually, I think, my first or second year of the PhD program. Um, that was interesting. That happened. At the time, I didn't really realize that it was a big deal. But people let me know that it was. And that was just a paper that I, had in class in the program. So in the PhD program, you'd write papers typically for most courses. You'd have like the theoretical part to a paper that you would, ultimately take to a journal at some point by adding some data. And so that paper was an interesting thought. The idea was about lending. right? And it's trying to help businesses get more money. And we looked at, bankers from a marketing perspective, and how could you market to them to be more likely to actually get money from them and more money from them? Because a lot of people start out and they don't have anything, right? So how can we make it more likely to get them some funds? Because people go down and get shut down all the time, right? It's like, well, you haven't demonstrated this, you don't have a credit history, and that's rattling for a lot of people. And I think you see a lot of businesses now giving people money in those situations, which helps them. But I went in and I interviewed loans managers at big banks and credit unions to see, because my intuition was that, there's a gray area there. It shouldn't be just black and white. And they validated that. They said, yeah, it's not always clear whether, this person would be a good or bad candidate. So they lean on a softer side beyond the numbers related to emotion a little bit. And so that there is possibility to almost, from a sales perspective, to sell them on yourself and your ambition and the fact that you can make this happen. So that's the idea behind the paper, and brought it to a conference, and it got best paper. I don't know if it deserved it or not, but it was a pretty cool experience early on for me. But to circle back to your question about, the future, the flow stuff, a lot of what we're doing right now is talking about the dangers of flow, which is really interesting. And Disney, so the new movie Soul?
I don't think I do.
Okay, so they came out with this new movie Soul, and I was watching it the other day, and it's basically talking about flow. It talks about, like, my research, how flow is this state. It's like this magical state is how they describe it. And they literally talk about it that way. And they show these people in flow, whether they're playing instruments or, working, and they pull them out. Like, if they want, they'll throw a rock at them. It's kind of like this imaginary, like, heaven type of place that people are in when they're so locked into what they're doing, and they pull them out. But they also, which was fascinating to me, is they talk about the dangers of flow, that flow pulls you from reality, right? So people can get so caught up in, let's say, work or, playing an instrument, that they lose touch of their relationships with other people. And there's dangers if you get too caught up in it. And so I thought it was fascinating, because that's been the nature of a couple of my recent publications. And this is a huge deal. This applies to stuff like, binge watching TV. Social media use is a huge application of this, because marketers have tapped into flow states by creating these, seamless and endless experiences, right? If you think of social media, and it sounds like TikTok's doing a really good job of this, they nail the fluency side. Is there's just endless content, and it's seamless in that you watch a movie, another one pops right up. It's effortless to get to the new content, and their algorithms have it nailed in so that, they know what you're looking for, right? And they have themed content that comes up so they know it's relevant to you, so it'll absorb you. So they got the absorption and the fluency component, and it creates this micro flow state, and people are hooked. And so they've nailed flow, and it's a disadvantage to consumers because it's so enjoyable during it. You can't put it down. It's addicting. And so flow underlies the addictive nature of stuff like social media. One of our papers, we looked at gambling. So it was online gambling. And, in a lot of studies from a marketing perspective, we're trying to see, okay, how can we get consumers in flow since they love it so much? And there's benefits from the marketing perspective. You're more willing to pay for it. You want to engage with the product later, all that stuff. So most of our studies were trying to get people in it. And then we studied online gambling, and we couldn't get people out of it, right? So it's really fascinating, I think, to look at that context, because that's one where it was tough to stop flow, and online slots in particular. We were throwing messages up on the screen. So, after a minute of play, it'd say, you've been playing for a minute, beware how much money you're spending, that kind of stuff. And people just exit and keep going. we would give them warnings before playing saying, hey, be careful. This game is conducive to flow. You know, it's dangerous because you'll play for longer and lose money. None of that could stop it, right? Because if you think of the design of online gambling and slots in particular, you're getting really interesting reinforcement constantly. You're hearing the sounds, right? You're seeing reinforcement in the spinners, and you're gambling money, a potential to win a lot of money. So it's absorbing, right? It's really interesting and of value to you. So they got you hooked in the potential to make money. They have the continuous stream of reinforcement to make it fluent, and it's tough to pull people out of that. And so it's, when you think about it in that way, that's essentially what social media is. That's what a lot of, you know, TV programs do. It's flow. And so it's dangerous for consumers in that sense. And so it's a little bit of what we're doing. We have a paper that looks at the negative effects of flow on creativity too, which is interesting because people associate flow with creativity. They'd say, I'm in my creative flow. And so that's like, if you're, you know, let's say working on a paper, for me, if I'm in flow while creating the paper, they say that that'll help. But what we look at is, let's say you experience flow throughout the day, you're on social media. Let's say you take a break and you're on social media, or you play a game on your phone or listen to music. If you experience flow in that task, you're going to be less creative in the next task, because flow has you constrained into a limited amount of information, and you have it processing so fluently, you want to just keep it going, right? Like, it, you know, when you experience a flow state, whatever you're doing, you just want it to keep going, right? You just want to think about that. And so that's a challenge. When you go to the next task, it's tough to think differently about it, because that sort of mindset carries forward. So that's interesting. So yeah, flow is great and there's a lot of benefits to it, but we're showing some of the negatives too, and the dangers of it.
Yeah, I never would have considered attaching that value to it, but like that's like you say. And actually, when I was looking at your publications, it was cool how you know, were relating to gambling, and it's like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? Because you might not, you know, a person might not think they compare that to a flow state of like sport and all that stuff. It's like, hey, you just watched 3 hours of TV. You were in an emotional flow state where everything came to you pretty easily, right? And you know, I'd be really curious. Are you guys looking into? I know it'd probably require a lot more funding. Is like one of the things I understand is a lot of these things have such a huge dopamine response, and like kind of like the brain activity and stuff like that. Have you seen any relation to that, or?
Yeah, so we actually have a grant from SHIRK, which is this huge granting agency in Canada. Actually, Laura's involved in some of that work too on the physiological side. So we found that heart rate variability, I mean, this is probably nonsense to most people, and respiratory rate and depth are related to flow and differently related to the two dimensions. So, I mean, we're getting into that, and there's actually a decent amount of literature on the physiological side of flow. So we're slowly getting into that with that grant that we have. But for me, it's really important first to lock down what exactly flow is. And then it's got these two dimensions to it, because that literature in particular is looking at flow as one dimension. It's just flow. But we're saying it's really important to tease out those two dimensions. And that's what we showed in our first couple studies on the physiological side is, you know, the heart rate variability is related to the fluency component, and then respiration is related to the absorption component. So to answer your question, yeah, we're getting into it now, but like EEG and that kind of stuff, that's a whole nother language. That stuff's really complicated, and that's not my expertise, but there is a decent literature on that for sure.
So, with all this stuff that you're kind of focusing on, I know you were writing a book on it. Is that correct?
Yeah, I started the book, I don't know, a couple of years ago, but for me, I want to make sure that I get a lot of this stuff published first so that people know who I am and have some credibility. based on the publications. Because I mean, we've run hundreds of studies on flow. We've been studying it in depth for the past 6-7 years. And we've applied it to so many different domains and contexts, and there's a lot of really interesting insights there. But for me, it was, get this stuff out first, then it'll give you credibility to sell the book later. But I'm really excited about the book because, like we've been talking about here, flow applies to everybody throughout your day, whether it's positive or negative. And I really do think it's a fascinating topic that, like you say, is under researched because it's so confusing. It does seem like this magical state that people they can't quite put their finger on what exactly it is. So I think that by showing what it is and helping clarify for people what it is and how common it is and identifying it throughout their day, that it'll have a ton of value for, your average person and the general public. So I'm really excited about that book. And it's on pause now. So it's funny that you mentioned that. I was thinking about this the other day. I was like, when am I going to get back into the book? But we got some really cool stuff going through right now that the book will build on. So I'd imagine I dive back into the book maybe in the summertime to push it. But yeah, so yeah, look for that soon. I'm going to dive back into it. I think it's going to be really cool. It's just so fascinating to learn about flow. I remember reading the first book on flow by Csikszentmihalyi. He wrote that back in the 70s, 1975. And so it's been around for a while, but people didn't really start studying it much academically until early 2000s, when the internet became popular. It was used a lot there. It was seen as this state that you'd get in when you use technology. And so it kind of started blowing up then, but it's been around for a decent amount of time.
Yeah, no, I loved because it was really only spoken about, like you say, as a magical state, and they only talk about, almost, it seems like, the more beneficial version, the version that you might feel like completely in the zone. But now that you have this capability of measuring micro versions of it, and like you say, you can have it for an instant, it could be 10 seconds to an hour, or even longer. But initially when I heard flow, it was like it was just the ultimate flow state, right? And I'd be curious if, down your research, you could start looking at the quality of the flow, if there's even there's an intensity to it, if there's the different stuff like that. But I'm really wondering, what's some advice you would actually recommend for people to utilize, just the hope for having flow in their life, to become immersed into things, and to utilize this as a positive thing in their life.
Yeah, so a lot of it is indirect. It's not one of those things where it's like you want to force flow, but it's interesting. There's a lot of parallels to what we talked about already today. Flow emerges naturally if it's something that you're very interested in, right? So earlier when we talked about motivation, and we talked about the fact that I love my work, that's highly related to flow, right? Because it ties into that absorption dimension and the fluency dimension, right? So there's something that you're really passionate about. It's kind of like that, the mechanism I was talking about before, where if you need to pay attention, you need to focus. Let's say it's a really important game in hockey, you're going to get there. It's the same kind of mechanism when something's really of value to you, your identity and what you believe in, right? So you find something that you're passionate about, and that's where we find flow happening, is in people's favorite activities. That's when it's most likely to happen. So you find that thing that gives you a spark that you're really interested in. It's going to happen naturally. And the fluency part of it is largely based on how good you are at it. If you're an expert, if you have skill set in it, the task is going to go by more fluently, right? You don't have to think. And I can translate this into working out. I remember, we'd have workouts early on, and you're like, think of this, think of that, do this, do that. And you can't get into flow early on when you're a beginner. It's very difficult too, because let's say I'm doing a movement, I'm thinking about where this is, that is. So I'm not in the actual experience. I'm in here. I'm paying attention to each little move. Then this is interesting. I actually started noticing this more recently. The moves are more natural and I can focus on one thing. I can get into it because I'm more of an expert now, and it's more fluent for me because the movement, I know what I'm doing. I don't have to think about it as much. So find something that you're really interested in. So that'll lock in your absorption component. And then as you practice it and do it more and more, the fluency component will come. Okay, so
Yeah.
it's more about setting yourself up for flow, right? If you're like, I mean, you can focus, and that's another thing too, is if you train yourself in mindfulness, I highly recommend that. So being able to recognize when a thought is distracting, or just recognizing your thoughts in general, will allow you to dial back in and be more resistant to that kind of stuff. So that'd be a second tip for me, is train your mind, and attention underlies all this, right? Because if you're someone that attaches to a fleeting thought or emotion, you're not going to be able to sustain flow. You can't, by definition, sustain your attention to the task. You're paying attention to your thoughts or emotions. So that would be a second recommendation, I guess, would be that training in mindfulness. But yeah, find something that you're interested in, and I guess being able to focus on positive things is important too, because there's so much that goes into this and so much that can help you. But I think those are the biggest things. If you're in, let's say you're in a task and you're paying attention to things that are going wrong, or little things that aren't working out perfectly, that's going to pull you away from the task. But if you can focus on things that are positive and going well, that'll silence that stuff and allow you to focus on that task more closely. So those would be my big tips, right? Is learn how to train your attention, and then seek out things that will naturally draw your attention in and be fluent. And you can help yourself by looking for the positive in activities, right? Things that are going well and things that are going good, to help you focus your attention on it.
Yeah, I don't know why, just when you're describing all that, I really understood it as a good analogy of boxing, because learning the boxing skill. Now, one of the things you see in novices is no fluency and all intensity. So even just that first component is kind of overwhelmed. Now, you had talked about too, where it's like when you're learning the bench press, it's like, okay, think of this, this, and this. And I remember learning in school where they talk about, you don't want. I actually argued my prof for this because I had a paper to back it up. That she said that you don't want to think about the individual movements, you want to think about the movement as a whole. And then I backed it up. I said the research shows that if you're a novice, you need to work about the individual movements until you get an understanding of it. Then you took the movement as a whole. So at a novice level, it's impossible to really get in a great flow state or to know an exercise well. And then, like what I was going to say with boxing, and you mentioned the fluency state, what I think about is watching the evolution of an individual learning boxing, because they have to look at these little things. So it's like they're actually overstimulated with emotion and they don't have fluency because they don't know how to fluently control their patterns from basically their hips using the right muscles. In time, they get out of, like, a lot of people talk about the sympathetic nervous system versus the parasympathetic nervous system when you look at sport performance, and you want like a nice balance, right? And especially in a sport like boxing, you're actually trying to quiet the sympathetic nervous system a lot, because it's like a fight or flight. It's like you have to be okay knowing that he's not going to actually kill you. You're ready to battle, but you're not going to die, right? And so when people first come in, they think they're actually fighting their life for their
Yeah,
life.
yeah. Yeah,
So,
you're bang on. So yeah, you're right. And Csikszentmihalyi talked about that early on, which I love. Is he talked about an affect grid, so an emotion grid, right? Whereas you can go negative to positive, but then the arousal or activation level is super important. And so that's actually really important for flow. And that's what you just said, right? It's like flow happens in that optimal channel, he called it the flow channel, right in between being excited and calm,
Yeah.
right? Right. So that's exactly where it lies. And you just describe people when they start, they're way too excited,
Mm-hmm.
and they're not going to be able to get into flow. On the flip side, if the task isn't challenging enough, you'll be calm, right? Which isn't flow either. So it is that very delicate region right in between those. And so he would recommend always finding tasks where, it's challenging you just enough, right? Because if the task isn't challenging enough, you don't have your full attention. If it's too challenging, you start freaking out like that.
Yeah.
So he recommended being in tune with that, challenging yourself and pushing yourself just enough so that it requires your full attention, but that you can perform well enough that you still have a fluent experience.
Yeah.
Because that's the other thing too, that our kind of two dimensions are giving light to, is like we showed that you make a task harder, it increases the absorption into it because you need your full attention to do it and your full resources, but it decreases fluency, right? So you're in a really difficult task, you're fully in it, you got to be in it, but your performance drops off, it's not as fluent. On the flip side, you make something really easy, it's super fluent, you're blasting through this, and it's kind of whatever, you're not paying full attention, you don't need to. So that's a really interesting parallel to what you were talking about on the emotional side of things, is the arousal level of emotion is right in that delicate zone there, that medium ground.
Yeah, and just talking about more that whole idea of parasympathetic versus sympathetic, and I've been really fascinated with this new realm of discussion around breath work. And what a lot of strength conditioning coaches are doing with their individuals is actually getting nasal breathing as a focus. So with a lot of people, breathing in their chest, all uptight. And, that's where you get people who have high cortisol levels because they're actually just on a daily basis at work or life, they're actually causing a sympathetic kind of drive in these micro forms. But then when you actually focus on nasal breathing, it sends more of a parasympathetic, which is the rest one, the calming agent. And they're really trying to work with a lot of athletes to utilize this in order to actually calm themselves in a very intense scenario. And so they'll I followed Phil DeRue, and he actually gets his guys to do breath holds and then to do nasal breathing. So you're actually in this, high hypoxic state, and then to actually nasal breathe. So then when they're in a fight, they're used to a hypoxic state. They're used to still doing the proper nasal breathing so that they're still trying to allow their parasympathetic to come out in such an intense scenario. And again, to try to, hopefully get into a better flow state too. Like, I think that would be a really interesting thing, is part of your research, if you guys could ever look at like utilizing some of the breath work information that's coming out there, because they look at it at both biomechanical and biochemical, where you're utilizing muscles in a different way, like for your breathing patterns, and then on a biochemical standpoint, how that affects your mind.
That's brilliant, and that's what your boy leader was talking about, Jeff. That's where he wants to go. He's part of that grant that I was talking about earlier, and he was saying the same thing, right? And you can think about flow. This is really a nice way to put it, actually. You can think about the cognitive side, which is the attention side that we talked about, being able to focus your attention and resist distraction. But then there's the affective component, like you just brought up, where we want to keep it in that moderate level of arousal. And that's what happens, right? You're in a task and you'll get too excited, or you start to worry a bit too much. So your ability to manage your emotions in the same way as your thoughts, your cognitions, is really important. And that's what he was saying, is he had some ideas for some experiments where we would have people go through certain breathing exercises, and then we'd put like their hand in a bucket of cold water or something, and to see how long they could last, and to see how that would influence their flow experiences in the next task based on breathing techniques. So that's fascinating. I think that's a really interesting avenue that we're going to pursue. And that's a good lesson for anybody listening if they want to get into flow. So I focused on being able to train your attention, but being able to train and manage your emotion, and the activation or arousal level is really important too.
Yeah.
That's dynamite. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, I've been trying to use a lot more nasal breathing, and it's really fascinating stuff. Like, just like intuitively, more intuitively from our environment, doesn't mean it's actually good, is that we're mouth breathers. And this changes so much of the behavior in our body and in our neurological system. And even just from, it takes a while to do, but getting used to nasal breathing, like, would you think of nasal breathing and jogging? And like, no, why would I do that? But it's like, but you can. And that would have a huge effect on your performance, because now you have a higher CO2 tolerance. And there's actually, my understanding is, you actually release more nitric oxide when you use the nasal passage. And so you're actually even just dilating your blood veins better, and just better overall performance in that sense. But yeah, it's still pretty new stuff too, in and of itself, right? So really, really cool stuff, man. So talked about a lot of stuff here. What's some other stuff, just before we wrap up here? What's some other stuff that you found really fascinating about psychology, just throughout your research years and stuff like that? One of the things you kind of talked about was, and I remember talking to you about this, that the idea of intrinsic and extrinsic motivators. And I don't hear a lot of people talk about the overlap in that, and how that, you talk about how you become immersed in these things. What's kind of some of the stuff around the motivators that you found?
Well, lots of stuff. So from a marketing perspective, most of the stuff, when you really boil it down, the biggest motivators are emotion and identity. And so I talk about that a decent amount in class. So, getting people to act by manipulating emotion and identity. Um, the social component is big too, like feeling part of a group, relatedness, that kind of stuff is huge. But yeah, most of it seems to operate through emotion and identity. And so, you can play with those two in a million different ways. And we actually started talking about emotion there, and how you can play with that yourself. But for me personally, and working out, identity seemed to be a huge part of it, because it wasn't until I identified as someone that, does work out, I wasn't as into it. Because for me at the start, I saw people that worked out as kind of meatheads. And, it was like, that's in my mind how I construed that identity. So I played a lot of sports, and I love playing the sports, but the workout side of it, to me, I perceived it before as, just meatheads, and not smart. And I don't know where that would come from. Maybe movies a little bit. They'd always, depict a guy with a bunch of muscles, but he'd be dumb. Mm-hmm. And so for whatever reason, in my mind, that's how it worked. Is like, hey, if you were someone that tried to get huge and you worked out all the time, that you were dumb. And I didn't like that. It's like, well, no, that's not me. And until I was able to break that kind of schema of what it meant to work out, I wasn't able to get in the gym. I just didn't see it as me. And then you start hearing stories, and, seeing people and meeting people that aren't dumb, right? And working out. And, I'm around it all the time with you and Quinn, and, seeing all these people work out, then it's tough to kind of break those schemas that you have, that are formed when you're younger. But then, I started to break that and start working out and started seeing some results. And then it became a big part of my identity. And then once it's part of your identity, then you don't think about it. You do it, and you need it. So I think identity is huge, especially for working out.
Yeah, that's actually, it's interesting, because I had heard it, and James Clear's got a book about habits, and I reread the book recently, and he talks about how people will always think like kind of, he has like three realms of habit forming, and there's the results on the outside and the process, and then the identity is the core. But people actually focus on the results, they try to do the process, and then they think they're going to become the identity. But you actually, if you identify as the person first,
Yeah.
I am a person who works out, I'm a person who does strength training, you're going to believe in the process, then the results come. And you kind of need that, because the results have to come in so much time. You have to maintain that identity the whole time, right? And you had the reinforcement from the results. But I
Yes.
think
Yeah.
if people can, like, it's where people kind of get lost, right? Is okay, I want to be fit, I want to be in good shape, so that's their very first motivation. It's not starting off with like, I want to be someone who works out, and then they try to do the workouts, they try to do the process, they don't get the results fast enough, and then they just go back to doing their old thing, and they go back to their old habits. So it's, and the other thing I was really curious of your view in this, because I talk about the intrinsic, extrinsic motivator, and you understand the research about a lot of this stuff, so that's why I like talking about it. Now, I've always said that the biggest motivators are both. Intrinsic motivators are good for us, and I'm not saying that they're not effective, because intrinsic being I enjoy it, so I do it. Extrinsic being the external motivators, like you show up for work because it's your job. But then something that can overlap and tie the two
Yeah.
together.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And so, like, you talk about, like, it's an emotional attachment to an extrinsic motivator. I want to work really hard for my teammates in a sport that I love, right? I want to work hard for, my family members, because I love my family members. Like, that's where you are always, like, because it's important to actually take it outside of just you, because especially when it comes to fitness and nutrition, and getting yourself out of your comfort zone. Well, if it's just about you enjoying it, some days you're just not going to care about how, like, yourself, or you're going to lie to yourself, or whatever it takes, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I love this because like flow is considered the optimal, ideal, intrinsically motivating state. So I love talking about that. But what I don't really agree with is saying, putting the two against each other. And the literature does a bunch of this. It's like, well, intrinsic's more important than extrinsic, and you don't need to do that. Like, they're both good. Like,
Yeah.
you just have them both. Yeah, I think that's so silly.
Well, and
Um,
I think that we could look at it as a continuum almost, or like an overlap, right? I think that there could be an intrinsic, extrinsic motivator, and an extrinsic dominant intrinsic motivator. You know what I mean? Like, something that overlaps your core values a little bit more.
Yeah, well, flow is that, right? Like flow,
Right.
in that paper that we're putting through right now, we show the importance of progress in eliciting flow. It's like the fluency part of it, right? It's like, okay, well, you're playing hockey and all these things are going well for you. That's going to give rise to the flow state. And so you end up getting the performance out of it too. By soaking into the process and the intrinsic component of it, you also get the extrinsic. So flow brings you both, which is
Yeah.
the beautiful thing about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like you say, just they always put the two against each other.
Yeah.
And it just, like, I don't understand why we can't identify two things as the same. Like, I mean, it might be like, I do see that, like, an extrinsic motivator is different than intrinsic to a degree, but you can enjoy intrinsically having an extrinsic motivator. I think that's your environment. I always say that your extrinsic intrinsic motivators are, like, best example I have is people you care about, right? I think because they are external sources, but they matter a lot to you, and you love doing work for them, right? So that might be it. Like, that's not just a basic extrinsic motivator, that's something that has a part of your core values attached to it. And that's probably one of the most powerful things, because I mean, when it comes to, like, our family, when it comes to our loved ones, that's where we get out of our comfort zone the most, without hesitation, because it's not just about us.
Yeah. So the extrinsic, intrinsic would be more about the task, right? So like, is it something about the task? Then it's intrinsic. If it's not, then it's extrinsic. So like, you care about, the opinion of your, say, dad, that's extrinsic. Even though it matters to you, it's not intrinsic to the task, right? So yeah, I think you're right. A lot of stuff influences both. And I think that's a silly way to think about things, is, saying it's one or the other, because a lot of things related to the task also relate to performance, or things that you get extrinsically from the task too. So yeah, I agree with you there for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's great stuff, man. With Strong Ambitions podcast, I always like to know what is your ambition in the near future here? What do you really immersing yourself into in the near future?
I want to be the flow guy, baby. I'm published. I want to be the new flow guy, and we've got so much awesome stuff on flow, and it's finally flowing through the journals. We've got a couple key pubs that one that's floating through right now. The new scale and way to think about it is going to be the big one. And so for me, I want to be known as the flow guy, and then, take that into many different avenues. I mean, we talked about the corporate side of it. We have a paper on group flow, which is really exciting, and that's getting close to being put in a journal here right away too. That would tie into, group performance in organizations, and then the individual flow stuff does too. The positive psych side of it applies to, students, learning, general public. So to me, the big picture for me is become an expert in flow and recognize as that expert in flow, publish that book, and then start pushing that stuff out to different contexts, because it applies to everything. It's related to performance, right? And well-being. So it's applicable to a lot of stuff.
Yeah, totally. So, if you would you like to leave Instagram or anything like that where people can find you and find a little bit more of your stuff?
Yeah, of course. So on Insta, it's at Ray Labs. LinkedIn, I got some of my work posted on there. Raymond Lavoie, just my name. And then I have a website too, raymondlavoie.org. So check it out. Contact me. I love to collaborate. So, with my research, no matter what, context or industry you're in, I like to apply it there and have these, practical field studies. So it's been a lot of fun. I worked with companies like Manitoba Opera and Liquor and Lotteries in Manitoba, and you name it, virtual reality developers. And so we come up with these cool studies to test the impacts of flow, and it's got benefits for both. So reach out to me. I love to collaborate in any way possible, and hopefully give some insights to you or your company, whatever it may be.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you so much for joining the first show here, and I'm certain we're going to have you on again here in the next year.
I hope so. Yeah, this was a blast. Thanks for having me as your first guest, man. It's an honor and a pleasure. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay, we'll talk soon. Thanks again to my guest, Ray. That was so much fun. Definitely going to be sure to have him on again and find out more about his research and even more applications that people can really find out about, because from what you heard in that conversation, it's a very important part of life, and we can have it all over. So it'd be great to have him on there, and we can actually dive into even more details later on. Be sure to tune in next week, because next week I have an old sparring partner, someone that I always looked up to in the sport of boxing, Brent Butt, and I literally would always use him as a reference point for, good technique and understanding and what makes a really good athlete, but even in and out of the ring. He was a former national amateur boxing champ. He won gold at nationals, and he's now one of the head coaches at United Boxing Club. But he's also a very successful partner at Endeavor Wealth Management. So he took everything he had in the ring and he applied it to life. And he's another person who I see just absolutely focused on their ambitions. So this will be a really good conversation. It'll be very interesting to hear what really drives him and allows him to be so determined. So thanks for joining today. I really appreciate it. Remember to subscribe, leave a review for the show, and don't hesitate to check out my website, rqtrainingnutrition.com. You'll find more resources if you're really interested in this stuff on my NEM forum, where I talk nutrition, exercise, and mindset. So remember, it's not the pursuit of happiness, it's the happiness in pursuit.